Hello Internet, and welcome to another episode of Experimental Cataclysm, the show where we talk about recent changes to the experimental version of Cataclysm Dark Days Ahead. And we're just going to hop into it today. There's no other plug for my other content. There's been no other content. Things have been pretty busy in my personal life, and although we're not going to get into it here, I will say that content may be light for a couple more weeks as well. So first up today, I want to talk about cash registers. Now, I initially saw this PR from Lovum. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say your name, but it was from this person talking about adding cash registers to various big locations in the game. And I thought this was odd because I didn't know that we even had cash registers in the game. So when I did a little digging, I found about a jillion PRs from this person that tweaked a lot of the map gen in various locations, in addition to obviously adding cash registers to the game. So for example, just grabbing one here, the bakery had its kitchen area and toilets changed so that they have linoleum flooring. Many of these changes have had small updates to their flooring or to their roof layout or shape or whatever, and all of them were being updated to use the new cash register item. Now, I wasn't really aware that all of this had been happening, but it looks like this was happening over the last month or two, and I just didn't know about it, and it's big enough that it definitely deserves a shout out. So regarding the cash registers specifically, I know it's a simple thing, but I am pretty happy to see this. Previously, our registers were basically just computer terminals that we slapped in stores to take the place of a proper register. Converting them to cash registers makes sense realistically, and from a game perspective, changing them to an item rather than a piece of furniture also makes sense. So anyway, cash registers are set to only contain currency items and certain notes. You can find currency inside of them, though we all know that currency in this game isn't exactly a necessity. Now, I do think that this should be changed. We have several faction issued currencies that should probably be permitted inside of a register, not because you would find these currencies in the register like when you go out to loot a store, but just in case someone wants to take one home and use it as a piggy bank or whatever. These registers are also modern, so they're made up of electronics components and have an LCD screen attached. This means that you can disassemble them for parts, which is really the only thing the old terminals were good for anyway. Next up today, we've got the addition of a visual representation of armor coverage from Disassembly. I still don't know how to say your name, by the way, sorry about that. This PR adds a map showing coverage in item entries. Simply open the item entry for a piece of armor and you will see a display for which body parts are covered by the garment in question. Now, although I think that this looks nice and it's a totally fine addition, I do not think it should be at the top of the entry. It is too large, and the vast majority of the time when I look at an item entry, I am not looking for this information. So to me personally, it occupies a lot of space with information that I generally don't really care about. However, that is just my opinion. Obviously, other people will feel differently. I think if you moved it to the bottom of an entry or placed it below some of the other information in the entry, it would not bother me as much. But anyway, for people like me, there is a way to disable this new map. It's enabled by default, but if you go to your settings, head to the interface tab and check line 53, you can either enable or disable the feature. I feel sort of bad telling you that it's not for me and how to disable it. I really don't think it's a bad change or anything, I just personally won't use it and figured I'd tell you how to turn it off. Next up today from Reuven, we've got some updates to a lot of armors in the game. Over the previous months, we've seen many updates to sublocations for different body parts. We haven't really talked about them in depth, but mostly that's just because it's pretty straightforward. Also, this is still happening, by the way. Shoutouts to Ballistic. I saw he added the soles of feet as a new sublocation just the other day. Anyway, these new sublocations mean that many armors in the game needed to be updated with new information, and that's what this PR does. In fact, there are more than one PR addressing this problem. So I'll slap some comparisons on the screen. Old entries are on the left and new ones are on the right. So if we look at the hiking boots here, for example, the first thing you'll notice is that there are more locations listed in the entry. Again, that's the expansion to the new sublocations. So here we can see that it covers your ankles, your foot arches, your heels, toes, and bottoms of your feet, which, man, now that I've read all of those out loud, there's actually a ton of sublocations on your foot. Now, regardless, you can see the coverage here and the values that have changed slightly. And for the soles of the feet, you will see that the protection is very good, and that's because these boots have a very thick sole. That's part of the appeal of having these sublocations. We can specify coverage and protection values for each individual part of the garment. And also obviously material and thickness as well. Anyway, right, so that's the change. Reuven went through many foot-related and coat-related items. Those were the PRs that I noticed, and they updated them to include the new sublocations. Some of these also changed protection values or added new protection values for specific sublocations. And again, the example here would be the sole of your foot having a much thicker rubber sharper sole than it did previously. Well, I say that, but it didn't actually have a sole of your foot previously, so it's completely new. Now, doing all of this is actually probably quite a lot of work, and since we have so much armor, you're probably going to see more of these PR updates in the future addressing lots of different articles of clothing. Since some of the materials have changed, some protection values have changed, it may be worth giving a look over your gear and seeing if it's still what you want. None of the changes that I saw were super nerfs or anything, but I didn't look over every single change, so it is worth taking a glance at your equipment. But anyway, that's all I've got for that change. Next up today, we've got the ability to disassemble large objects from MQ Rouse. Apparently trying to disassemble something required the player to pick it up in their hands. This meant that very large or very heavy items could not be disassembled. Now regardless, this no longer requires the players to hold objects in their hand for disassembly. There's really not much to say here. Obviously it tracks with realism and it should be possible, so it's a nice little change. Next up today from Della Riffert, we've got the addition of Makeshift ballistic plates. So at this point, most or all of the ballistic vests in the game have been updated to use the new pocket system for carrying ballistic plates. However, we could only harvest these plates from existing ballistic vests. There was no option to make a makeshift version. And it's one of those situations where yes, they were designed to use ceramic plates, but it's also literally just a pocket, so there's no reason we can't slap our own steel plates in there. So this PR adds improvised plates of the ESAPI and ESBI varieties. These are called scrap plates and both are auto-learned at Fabrication 2. Now, although I support the addition of an improvised plate because, you know, it tracks with realism, we could just shove some steel in there, I do have many problems with this particular implementation. So first up, these recipes do have a string and fabric component, which I think is implying that we're just stitching these metal pieces into a little fabric pouch. In the description, it says that we do this to cover the sharp edges of the metal that we're putting in there. But I believe this is actually an attempt to circumvent the need for welding or any kind of metalworking, forging, whatever. Since, for example, we can use 50 scrap pieces of metal to make this object, it's kind of a ridiculous recipe. If I shove 50 little pieces of metal into a pouch, it's most likely not going to stop any bullets. The recipe can also pretty much be every type of steel available to the player, but it will always have the same volume, weight, and protection values, which doesn't make sense without forging or welding of some kind. Because like I said, not every type of metal piece that we have in the game would be suitable for making an armor plate. And if we compare these items here, the ESAPI improvised plate, which is the metal we were just talking about, versus the ceramic plate, we can actually see there are some issues. For example, the improvised plate is only a third of the weight of the actual ceramic plate. It is also 8 times smaller in volume, which neither of these things make sense. If we're putting these replacement plates in the same pocket as the real plate, why would it be 8 times smaller in volume? It might be thinner, sure, it's not as thick as a ceramic plate, but 8 times less volume doesn't really track. And look, I don't know how heavy these things actually are, but if I go to Google and I type is steel or ceramic heavier, the first thing that pops up talks about how ceramic body armor plates are lighter but thicker than steel. So it doesn't make sense to me that these improvised plates are made of steel, but they are lighter and smaller than the ceramic. And I don't mean a little bit smaller, they are significantly smaller than their ceramic counterpart. It even says in the description that these steel plates are heavy despite being significantly lighter than the ceramic counterpart. But anyway, it's probably best that I don't rant about it. The point is, you can now make these improvised ballistic plates. I personally feel that the idea of putting loose metal into a pocket is ridiculous. This should probably be a forging or welding recipe that has you making a proper piece of metal plating. And if the pouch type plate with the fabric idea is going to stay in the game, then it should probably be restricted to only use the larger steel pieces. Using 50 loose pieces of scrap metal and stitching them into a pouch is not a ballistic plate, and it does not match the description of the item. Anyway, didn't mean to rant about it. The PR does say that the person making this, they said that they're new. The PR does also say that this was okayed on Discord, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say probably the idea itself was okayed, but no one actually reviewed the changes in detail. Or maybe I'm completely misreading something. Maybe there is an explanation for how 50 pieces of scrap metal come together to be a metal plate. I'm often overly critical of things, you probably know that by now, and while I do believe the things I pointed out are issues, I'm not trying to discourage this person from contributing. And on that note, next up today from the same individual, we've got the addition of stamina information listed on weapon entries. Now there's not a whole lot to talk about here. If you check a melee weapon, you will now see stamina use showing the cost to swing the weapon. There's also a line for typical damage per stamina. And what is listed here, this is actually damage per unit of stamina. Now as a player, you actually have no context for a unit of stamina, right? We don't see it in a number form, we only see those bars. But you also don't really need to know what the exact unit is to grasp this information. When you compare two weapons, you don't really need to know what the unit means, you can just look at how the values compare. For the cost, however, I do think it was a smart decision to use a percentage here instead of an actual value. I think that's a good call. So yeah, anyway, I personally probably won't look at this too much, but it's valuable information that I'm sure quite a few of you will find valuable. It was also stated in the PR that this change came about because Vormithrax had talked about wanting it in a stream, so shout outs to Vorm. And then finally today we had two separate PRs that changed things about axe wielding ferals. Now I'm sure you're probably all aware of this, but we have a wide variety of ferals in the game. Most of them are pretty similar in the sense that they are like the base creature is always just a feral. The difference between them is the weapons that they are using to interact with the player. Basically, it's not like a zombie, which comes in a huge variety of sizes with different powers and abilities. Ferals are pretty much the same, differentiated by the weapon that they're holding in their hands. And one of those mad lads carries an axe. So first up, we had this PR from Aaron. They pointed out that the axe feral's damage is quite low for something that's, hitting you with an axe. And frankly, I've never been hit by an axe, but I'm pretty sure Aaron's right. It would be bad. I mean, not to kink shame, if you're into like hatchet play or whatever, you do you. But anyway, yeah, axes should hurt the player. And if we look at the damage on the fire axe, which was the weapon that they always dropped, we can see that this is a very powerful weapon in terms of raw damage, 51 total damage in fact. But previously the axe feral could only deal a maximum of 23 damage, which obviously is significantly lower. Now in the game we don't actually directly connect enemy damage to player damage, meaning that an enemy with a weapon is not guaranteed to do the same amount of damage that a player would do with the same weapon. However, I personally do think it should be that way. If I hold an axe and hit something and a feral has the same axe and hits something, I personally think that we should do roughly the same amount of damage. So anyway, seeing these low numbers, Aaron did buff the damage of the axe feral. Previously they did an average of 17 with a maximum of 23, and now they deal an average of 24 and a maximum of 33. They also removed their ability to throw rocks, saying that because they're holding an axe with both hands, they're probably not throwing, baseball-sized rocks at the player. And I really like this as well. I find it annoying that so many ferals have the rock throw ability. But anyway, that's the first PR, and it's totally fine. There's nothing really bad about it. I do sort of wish though that with the damage buff they had pushed back their spawn frequency / the date at which they first start appearing in the game. I would personally even like to see their damage buffed a little further, but I would also like to see them start spawning a little later in the game. Now the other PR is from Terminator, and they made it so that instead of dropping one particular weapon, ferals can now drop multiple weapons. So in the context of the axe feral, they went from dropping the fire axe 100% of the time to now having multiple axes that they could possibly drop. And again, this change is mostly fine. However, I do think that the range of items does not fit with the change from Aaron. So for example, two of the weapons that the axe feral can now drop are the fire axe and the ice axe. The fire axe, as we discussed previously, has a total of 51 damage, whereas the ice axe only has a total damage of 28. Now this is a pretty broad range, and it's not really reflected in the axe feral's damage. Anyway, like I said, neither of these PRs are especially problematic. I just think that the abstraction of damage is not great. What I would like to see is to separate the axe feral into two different enemies. One that would appear earlier in the game and use the lower tier axe weapons with lower damage, and then another stronger one that uses more powerful axes and spawns later in the game. I think that there should be a connection between the damage and the weapon that they're using. Ferals are essentially just very human creatures, so it doesn't make sense for them to have damage that does not compare to the weapon that they're using against the player. Now this PR also added other weapons to the crowbar feral, which is more problematic in my opinion. Not only do the dropped weapons also have a range of damages like the axe, but one of the options is the makeshift crowbar. Now the makeshift crowbar only appears at a very low spawn rate in 1 or 2 locations. It is dominantly an item that exists so that it can be crafted by the player. Ferals in the game do not craft. They don't possess the reasoning to say, okay, if I craft this item, I will be more capable in combat. So to me, it doesn't really make sense that they would have an item that is pretty much only ever crafted. Ultimately, like I said, both of these PRs are fine. I just have some opinions about how I would prefer that this shake out, but that of course comes from me, and I'm, it's been years since I contributed anything to the project. Always feel sort of bad criticizing things when I myself don't actually do anything for the project. But let's not pull at that thread and have my whole channel unravel here. So everyone, that's it for the video this week. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll be back in a couple weeks with another episode, so I'll see you next time.